So the good thing is we have the consultancy perspective, the client perspective from Maureen, and from Mark over there, we have an actual research and measurement guy.
So before we start, were we top of your list too? When you were thinking of your dream team?
I'm just doing the plug thing for Mark's book. He does have an offer for everybody that he will tell you about very briefly, and then we'll move into a conversation.
Yes, thank you very much. You did it very well. There's a Provoke discount if you go to the publisher's website, www.koganpage.com. And in the special offer blank, put in Kogan Page 20, and that's your discount. Thank you.
I have to tell you, I was directing my niece to a website the other day, and I said just what you said, www, and she was like, "Oh, let me get this down. Is it HTTPS / W? We don't do the www anymore." Okay. So, measurement. I love the title of the session, which is all yours, right, Tim? Goodbye, time and results, and hello, value and impact. And I'd like to sort of divide the conversation into two parts. What the first is that I'd like to start by talking about all the things that are wrong with that focus on time that has been our bête noire as an industry for as long as I've been here, and then start to talk after that about the value and impact and how we can move from that. So God, all of my stories start like this. Now, 20
you wrote about it, yeah.
20 odd years ago, I wrote a story in which I came to the conclusion, I think, that billing for time was the worst system I could imagine except for all the others. And the case that I made was that it was bad for employees. We were talking about mental health this morning, and the whole timesheet thing and the pressure to be billable creates a grind for employees that has to be unhealthy, I believe. It's bad for agencies because it commoditizes what you're trying to sell. And it's bad for clients because agencies have this perverse incentive to take 6 hours where they could do something in 1, where, just being able to bill you more. How did we get to this emphasis on time, and how have you experienced it in both as an agency and as a client? And I feel like I should ask the client, first of all, how we got to this emphasis on time, since I'm assuming that's how you just tell people you're going to pay.
So it's not. But I will say that, having spent a lot of time in agency too, I think you're right. It creates an emphasis on utilization, and overutilization, it creates this belief that is a positive, when in fact, I think it's actually negative for the client. So not only the incentive mismatch, but actually also the fact that value, right? You're creating a false, you're putting a false peg on sort of what's value and billing rates and time and what's valuable. And so it's one of those things where we know that there's got to be a better way, but the question is, what is a better way? And we've thought about it. And look, I'm the Chief Communications Officer for KPMG. We're a professional services firm. Very proud to say that we also were fast moving on Ukraine and a couple other issues that were raised. But the reality is that we're professional services. So we also are sort of looking at time and pricing and value. I would say in terms of kind of being on the client side now, really thinking about what is value and who provides it based on the outcome that we're trying to get to. So the most senior person who has the highest billing rate is valuable in certain instances, and the person who is maybe a programmer or can think of a different solution or a better way is going to be really valuable too. And so the question is, how do agencies bring that expertise to the client, and what is the responsibility of the client to be much more forward thinking in terms of how do we measure that value on a consistent basis, and what do we hold ourselves accountable to when we're kind of going for budget, when we're talking about reviews, when we're thinking about what do we value from an agency perspective. And I think it's one of those things where we know there must be a better way, and I think we've found it with some of our partners, but it's still too common that the default, kind of like PowerPoint slides, is sometimes to kind of the thing we know and is generally acceptable.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was agencies who started it or clients who started it.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think agencies have accepted
firms,
it,
they must have started
promulgated it. I think they borrowed it from law firms.
Okay, I was going to ask you about that. The origins are that we just decided to take it from law firms and management consultancies?
That's my assumption.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I think we've accepted it largely as an industry, and I don't know if there's any current polling on what percentage of agencies bill based on time, but I would say it's probably still dominant. And I think the reality is hourly billing makes you think small, because people think in like, oh, I did 15 minutes on this, I did an hour on this. Well, what is the value of that to the client? It is not 15 minutes or an hour. And as Maureen and I were talking earlier, I could be in one meeting and in 1 hour have an idea that might save a client $1 million. In the next meeting, I might have a stupid idea that the client think is just horrible, and they don't do anything with it. Well, the equivalent value, like we are equating those if we're doing an hourly billing model, but it should really be about what is the value and the impact that we deliver rather than the hourly billing. Now, on the same side, we've got internally with clients, I think there's been a results focus, which is good, but it's an intermediate step. Like, okay, well, what is the cumulative value and impact of those results? It shouldn't just be about the results, but I think the dominant form for both clients and agencies is time and results, and that's how most of the contracts are structured, and I think that's how most of the communications teams communicate to their stakeholders internally about their value.
Okay, we need to, I think, define our term here, because talking about results can mean lots of things to lots of people. I'd mentioned on the call that we had before this panel that, we measure results, or we ask agencies to measure their own results in the SABRE Awards competition, and this is presumably the best work that firms are doing. It's the work that they are most proud of. It's work that achieves great success, and I would say that still the overwhelming majority of entries in the results section tell you how loud they shouted, right? They tell you how many media clips they got, how many engagements they got on social media. Those are the quote unquote results, right? That we're talking about here.
Well,
what you've got you've been doing this almost as long as I have, because I remember meeting you in the 80s or 90s. How did we come to focus on that? And again, I wonder, just as we're blaming law firms for the hourly focus, whether we blame advertising firms, because advertising equivalency was part of this before we grew up, for this focus on just how much noise we made.
Well, it's an accessible way to measure, and it's still popular, and it's accepted by clients. So clients or corporate leaders perpetuate this shortcoming, because there's so much more that we could communicate. So in those awards programs, I've been a judge and I've seen the same thing you see. So you get 40 entries, 3 distinguish themselves. Every judge knows how to get rid of the other 37 and focus on the 3. And it is those 3 that matter. And they tend to be big companies, but I think it's important for everybody to know that like more evolved forms of measurement is much more accessible now than it was even 5 years ago. So it doesn't have to be expensive, doesn't have to be complicated, doesn't have to be too sophisticated for you. It's accessible to everybody. So I think that those barriers ought to be falling. Unfortunately, we make choices as a profession not to do it.
But why is that? Because I feel like, when did you say you wrote your first article on it? It was 20 plus years ago, right?
86.
Right, so a long time, right? We've been talking
Yes,
about.
I think we can agree it was a long time.
I
we don't
think you
need
have
to
some
dwell
readers.
on it,
Yeah.
just how long it's been.
A long
but
time
yes.
that we've been focused on it, and I would say, I don't know if it's accountability or if it's sort of just the norm, right? That is accepted, but I do think that the metrics of maybe not how loud you shout, but how much impact you have based on a particular program, a particular campaign, what you're trying to do in order to shape and advance and protect the reputation of your firm, and as an extension, your partnership with your agency. But I do wonder if we're also thinking about it kind of too specifically in that, well, it's media clips or it's social media, or it's because in my role and in my view, what we all do is we are the connective tissue that can see across an enterprise and predict kind of what's coming. We're monitoring, as the example of Michael Dell monitoring 100 things in the framework. We all have those frameworks, so we're monitoring things. We're looking around corners, and so the question is the measurement strictly kind of the thing that we do in terms of PR? From my perspective, it's not. We focus and hold the team accountable for trust, which includes employee engagement numbers, which includes media, which includes surveys of our internal stakeholders, but also external stakeholders. And that then is kind of our measure of, are we moving the needle or not?
Where does that come from, though? Does that come from your chief executive? Is that what he, I'm sorry, I don't know who.
Paul Knopp, he is a he, yes.
Okay.
It was a she before, but
didn't want to assume. That what is that his metric, or is that your metric?
Yeah.
Or okay.
Yes, but I would say that.
And across our global network, so we made it consistent. Sorry, Mark. We made it consistent across the global network, so it's our corporate affairs, metric.
So what I was going to say is that those executives who allow poor measurement are complicit in this equation. So they accept it.
Right.
And so we have to educate those executives about what PR is and what it can accomplish and how it can be measured in much more evolved ways.
But I would say this is where it's the communications leader's responsibility and the agency's responsibility to go create those metrics for the business. The CEO doesn't ask the CMO, or the CEO doesn't tell the CMO, this is your metric. The CMO goes to the CEO and says, here's how we're going to measure the impact of marketing. Communications is the one function within business that asks for permission for budget to be able to measure and asks questions about how we should measure. Why? We know how to measure. You've been writing about it for a long time. The IPR Measurement Commission, which Mark and I have both been a part of, have done a lot of really great work for it. AMEC does a lot of great work. There's plenty of knowledge out there. I think the trick here is that people default to easy metrics because either they don't know enough or they won't spend the money. Well, if you're going to spend the money on communications, include as part of that, embed as part of that, a measurement framework, and not just the simple X number of stories that we got or X number of clicks that we got. Look at it in the context of the business like Marine has, and I would say Marine's probably in the top 1% or maybe 5% of companies that have actually done that. Most of the companies we encounter are still stuck in very simple metrics. And it's not to say that you shouldn't track your media volume. It's not to say that you shouldn't look at media share. You shouldn't look at some of these baseline metrics. But how do those roll up to what is the impact on the business?
Well, and we're not perfect, just because I don't want to get too much credit for being up in the top 1%. We're not perfect. We still have a lot more work to do. But the other thing I would say, and I think you told us, go ahead and be provocative, argue on stage. The other thing is, I think we limit ourselves when we say, okay, PR, we're PR, and that's our lane, because actually we're influencing so much more than PR when we think about reputation and brand and sort of where we are in the market and how we integrate with marketing and what that means in terms of talent and culture and how we interact with and engage with legal. So to me, if we're only measuring the capability that is kind of PR, then we're missing everything else that we're doing across the enterprise.
So this is the way you become 1%. It's not so much what you do, it's what the other 99% are doing. So you do rise to the top because the standards are so low.
Oh,
I mean, I
Thanks.
gave that's a real world's tallest midget compliment, isn't it? But I gave a speech on measurement years ago, and talked about this, and then I had somebody come up to me at the end of it, the corporate communications person, who said, I agree with everything you just said, but I have to tell you, the happiest my CEO ever was with me, the time that he was most in love with public relations, was when I managed to get a photograph of him with his dog on the front page of Fortune. And that, for him, was the KPI for public relations, was I got my dog on the cover of Fortune. That speaks to everything
Ego.
that
Yeah.
was wrong with
But
us.
you
When
can
was
do
the
that
next
right? You can do that, and I think it's hard. I mean, look, I was on the agency side for a long time, and actually, I was told that if not Mark was a former client, not by I mean Tim was a former client, Mark wasn't. Tim, not by Tim, but by a client to say, I just want to be on the cover of Forbes. But the point is maybe you do that and to prove value.
Well, so do the 5 whys on that. So why do you want to be on the cover of Fortune? Well, it's because you have a belief, okay, apart from the ego bit, because you believe that there are readers out there who are going to read Fortune and do something, have an impression of your business, buy your product, go do something with your company. And I think this is where I think we've lulled ourselves into just complacency about accepting kind of this as belief as opposed to turning it into something that can be a productive set of metrics. So how do you go turn that belief system into something that you can measure so you can't just wait until the next time you can get the CEO on the cover with the dog of Fortune, because that ain't going to happen again. But what can you do to be able to drive consistent level of visibility to be able to go increase media share, market share, mind share, brand reputation, et cetera?
Okay, so that why question, right, is I think the pivot point for this discussion, because I again, after I started to analyze how Sabre Award entries were measured, and came to realize that frankly many of them sort of were measured in a very nebulous way, I started to go back and look at objectives.
Yeah.
And I suddenly realized we don't have, I mean, we do have a measurement problem, but we have a much, much bigger objective measurement.
Yes.
Because I would say that something like half of the campaigns that I look at do not have any objective at all, or the objective is, I was going to disagree with you about PR, but let's not go there. But the objective is get me some PR.
Yeah.
No, because I like the words PR. PR. Your
I do
job
too.
is to forge relationships with
Yeah.
the public. The measure of a relationship is trust, or it. But
Yes,
you know,
I agree with that.
But it's not media coverage anyway.
Yes.
Look,
Well-
so but many of them have no objectives at all, and the most common objective, when there is one clearly stated, is raise awareness. Right?
Without definition.
Yeah, no, and not only that,
Like
but
media
nobody
awareness
actually
or-
measures awareness. They then measure media coverage and
Yes.
assume that that translates into awareness, which maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But anyway, raising awareness is a stupid objective on its own, right? And it comes down to this question, why? What do you want that awareness to do? Where does that break down? Who's not asking that question? Who is saying, okay, we'll go out and raise awareness, and that's great for me as an agency because I know I can do that. I can control how much, I mean, more or less control how much awareness I get. But where's the client pushing back and saying, no, it has to be awareness that drives people into our stores. It has to be awareness that raises trust in our CSR programs or ESG programs. It has to be awareness that attracts more employees for engineering jobs. It has to be awareness that makes us look like we're a leader on DE&I. I mean, why are we not asking that question? I know you are because you're 1%. But
No.
why do we not ask that question, and why do we let people get away with not asking?
Many organizations do what you're describing. There's a science behind it. It's called market mix modeling. We talked about it the other day. And so that kind of statistical analysis can isolate the impact of any one of these marketing or communications elements. And so the outcome of raising awareness and public relations in particular is that it lifts all boats, that sales become more effective, advertising is more effective when the public relations activity is visible and positive. So that it can be measured if you go that far.
When here's where, from an agency or consulting standpoint, it becomes short-sighted. So if the agency accepts the raise awareness thing, or if they've written a goal to raise awareness, well, raise awareness from what to what? Do you have an existing benchmark and you're trying to raise it to what other level? Well, then the next question should be, well, how valuable is that to the company? So if we can raise your awareness from 5 to 10%, what is the impact of that to the company? So an example I'll give from a former client who is a CMO a couple times over and a client a couple times over. she did what I think is one of the bigger judo moves as a CMO that I've seen, in terms of the company would talk a lot in their in their earnings calls about their total addressable market, which every startup does, every mid-sized company does. As they're growing, they're trying to show that our total addressable market is growing and we're capturing a bigger percentage of the total addressable market. So that was baked into the mindset of the executive leadership team. Well, she knew from brand tracking studies that this company only had 5% awareness in the market. So she said, well, every time we are talking about total addressable market, divide that by 20, because that is actually our addressable market if they don't know who we are. So the reason she was doing that was to drive the budget conversation, to be able to go get additional money to invest in the marketing and communications work, to be able to go do that. And I don't think most people are thinking about it that way and looking at those metrics in a business context to be able to go reframe the discussion.
So I think that's a great example and exactly what happens, right? It's kind of, I think maybe the client isn't pushing back on raise awareness because no one has had the hard conversation of what are we actually trying to achieve and how are we going to achieve it? So what's our actual objective, not sort of, words on a page, and not in, not writing it after the fact, right? So actually going into it and building a program based on what we know, based on metrics, using the metrics and the details as an input into how we're going to go after what we're actually trying to achieve and how long it's going to take to achieve it. Because a lot of times it's a lot longer than the patience maybe that people have in those management discussions.
So in 1986 also, old timer, I started in this business and I thought research and evaluation was a driver of strategy. And I approached prospective clients talking about the importance of research and evaluation in strategy development. They would listen for like 5 minutes and they'd say, that's really great, Mark. How's this going to help us prove the value of PR? So it goes right to the heart of this question. And that was a long time ago. I can't even do the math. So I had to create an audit system that would uncover the often hidden value priorities and preferences of executives that because value is subjective, it's in their minds. And these senior executives in communication could not articulate what the senior executives who are responsible for funding and performance evaluation, what they really wanted. And so then that sets the stage for a conversation, maybe a negotiation of what's meaningful, reasonable, and measurable.
Right.
And those are the three elements.
So that's a really interesting question. Again, I was thinking about this a few years ago, and I remembered a survey that I'd seen from Edelman a long, long time ago, and I actually mentioned it to a couple of people at Edelman, I think including Richard, and none of them could remember the survey that I was referring to. It had been a one-off, not like the Trust Barometer commitment that we see now that's been great. It was a one-off survey that was about, it was asking CCOs about what they knew about their company's strategic plan and how much their communications plan, their communications strategy, was aligned with the company's strategic plan. And I don't remember the numbers, but I remember that the answer was not much and not much, right? That the communications plan seemed to exist almost entirely separate from the company's strategic plan. I assume that's not the case anymore. I mean, not at KPMG.
No, but it's not. But you can, but definitely not.
Does that surprise you, though?
But it does surprise me because actually I do think that there is often a scarcity of resources in the communications organization that you don't see in other organizations. And so if you aren't prioritizing and if you aren't having that conversation up front to say, if these are your 5 business priorities, here are the 5 here are the 5 ways and the outcomes we want to achieve to advance those priorities. If you don't have that conversation, you're going to have 1,000 priorities and spread like peanut butter across everything that the company's trying to do, instead of having the conversation to say we can absolutely add something else to our list. What do we take off? If you don't have that strategic conversation, you won't be able to go, I believe, deep on actually showing impact. And that, I think, is dangerous.
Maureen mentioned when we worked together at HP, so in a different time frame of the HP experience. So when I was on the enterprise marketing and communications team, we had 40 different priorities across the business. There was no, I had a $10 million budget and a 40-person team, so I had plenty of resources, but not enough to cover 40 different priorities.
Right.
So we went through an exercise, basically created an A, B, and C matrix, and like, okay, the A-level priorities would get, let's say, $1 million per priority, and the B-level priority, and on down the line. And we created the framework. I didn't decide what the top priorities were, but I created the framework that forced the discussion for people to prioritize and say yes or no, or at what level. And I just don't think that typically happens because it tends to be there's a blank check syndrome with NPR. It's like we just keep doing more and just keep adding more. And if you look at all of the topics that were discussed at this event, we could keep adding more. Well, we need to prioritize, and we need to, in order to get the budget and the resources that we need, that's the only way that we can do it.
But that's a different conversation too. That's a very different conversation that you have with either your CFO, your business leader, your head of products, whoever it is. That's a different conversation to say, look, I will achieve X, but if X is no longer a priority, then let's you have to have that conversation right up front. And then the other thing I would say is, I think there was a session on Comtech earlier, which I think is really good and really good for us to advance. But I've also found in-house, we have to speak, I work for professional services, auditors, accountants. We have to speak their language, not only in understanding the business, but truly deeply understanding how the work gets done, what technology they're using. And so, my team will often sort of go into and create a dashboard in the same systems that our audit team is using internally to kind of make the point to put our language into a business frame that actually makes sense versus us trying to kind of educate about sort of the difference between PR and marketing. All of those things kind of don't matter. The point is, what are we going to do?
Tim, you said something earlier that I want to come back to because I think it's a very interesting point. And one I suspect we don't as an industry think about internally very much. You said where the PR is the only discipline that has to go to management to ask permission to measure what it does. It's fascinating to me. I moderated a roundtable in London a few years ago for a firm that had done some research, and it asked its clients basically, how compared to your PR budget, how much are you prepared to spend on measurement? And they were tremendously excited that their clients had come back and said, we're prepared to spend 10 or 20% of this money on measuring what we do. And I had to explain to them that their clients didn't mean we're going to give you an extra 20% on top of the budget to do the measurement. The clients meant we're happy for you to take 20% of the existing budget and use that on measurement. And they literally did not believe that that's what it meant until they went back to clients for clarification. But whose problem is that? Don't agencies in particular just have to accept that they have to measure because they're the ones who are going to lose the account if at the end of the day they don't do anything valuable?
Yeah, I would say it's both the client and the agency's problem. And I think as part of this, you need to drive alignment between client and agency, as well as between the communications team and the various stakeholders in the business. I think this is where just we continue to be a little bit lazy, a little bit complacent and short-sighted, where, ultimately, if the agency sees that it can increase revenues with a value orientation as opposed to a time orientation, this can start to change. So I'll give you an example of a client that we work with that's a unicorn-based startup, or unicorn size startup. We had been working with them for a while. They had a reasonable budget as a startup. They brought in a new CMO. The CMO had heard from the board basically about how much they believed in the company, the runway that they thought the company had, and that the company wasn't getting enough credit for being the innovator in the space, basically being the category creator in the space. The CEO is hyper competitive. So the CMO, reading the room and reading the instincts, basically said, okay, well, we'll double the media share for the business. Now, media share is an imperfect metric, but in that case, it's a proxy for we are going to be the category leader, and that's one of our ways to be able to measure category leadership. As part of that, we went through a discussion, okay, well, if we're going to double it, well, how quickly, what kind of time frame? He hadn't defined those things, but we had been tracking media share for a while. So we were able to go through and figure out, okay, what's it going to take us to increase the media share by 50%? And then what's it going to take to double it? And through the back and forth, we were able to say, okay, well, in order to hit that metric, we're going to need to essentially double our budget. Actually, it was a little bit more than doubling our budget. We've hit those metrics now for 2 years running. There's been no pressure on the budget. There's been pressure on the marketing budget, and he's had to scale back on some things over the past 6 months in terms of digital demand gen, but there's been no pressure on the comms budget because there's alignment between us and them, and there's alignment between him and the CEO and the board about what they're trying to do.
How do you budget for your agencies to measure? Or, I mean, the other question, which we're not really addressing right now, is why would you want the agency to measure its own work anyway? And, shouldn't you be doing that in some third-party way? But
Yeah, so we, the way we work is that we are very much based on sort of specific things we're trying to do as part of our plan. So if it's a talent strategy, then we work with an agency, and it's based on talent. It could be our DEI metrics, but it's connected to the business, and we don't then just have a general kind of, we want to increase, although I have put raise awareness in plans before, I just want to be out there to say I've done it before. So that it's
we've had winners that had raise awareness as an objective.
Sometimes,
you just know it worked.
Yeah, so I've done it. Not proud. But I think to sort of say, okay, we're trying to achieve this specific outcome. We want to increase our campus recruiting by X%. So then how does the agency help us to do that? So that is more kind of how we go about doing it. But again, I think you have to have clarity, and I'm not claiming that we always get it right, because we don't, but you have to have clarity, and the client has to have clarity and voice internally to be really specific about what are we actually trying to achieve, and how does that thing that we're trying to achieve tie to the overall kind of brand and reputation that we're trying to advance.
You are a 1%er.
Oh gosh, stop.
Yeah, I'm telling
All right,
you.
we don't have time for love fest.
Yeah.
But I would say, going back to your question,
He was gonna drop the hammer on like a negative.
I was not.
going back to your question on the building in it, this is to me where it just needs to be built into the budget. It shouldn't be a separate question. It shouldn't be a separate budget.
Yeah.
If you're going to invest in communications, dial in 10%, 20%, whatever you think is right to be able to invest in that. And don't just do it for measurement as a back end scorecard.
Right.
Do it for research, analytics, and measurement as a continuing part of the process. So month in and month out, you're learning from what's working and what's not working, and investing in the places that you need to invest.
So I didn't answer your
research
question.
To improve, not to prove.
And I didn't answer your question. I just realized as you kind of, thank you, you pulled me right back. But I think the other piece of it, so I use the talent example, is that that's not just PR. That is not just my team. That is in integration with and a team effort to say, okay, here's how much it's going to cost. Here's the ROI on that. And here's kind of what talent and culture, here's what the business is going to contribute. Here's what we contribute. Here's what marketing contributes. And here's what we're going to achieve together as a team, which is easier said than done. But I think it's really important.
Right. So we've gone over in a lot of detail what's wrong, which is the easy part, right? Again, my historical perspective, I've been doing this, and there was a huge burst of enthusiasm, it seems to me, about 20 years ago for marketing mix modeling, and then I didn't hear much about it after that. I went through a whole era where half the CCOs that I spoke to were being measured insanely on whether their company went up or down on the Fortune Most Admired list. I despair. We went through 10 years ago or 12 years ago, the Net Promoter Score era. Let's create advocates and reduce, my favorite word, badvocates. We've had all of these things dangled in front of us as the solution. I mean, the guy who invented Net Promoter Score called it the ultimate question, like we'd solved everything. What does measuring value and impact ideally look like? how do we get there?
Yeah, well, there's not one metric, so that's the easy answer. I think there are a lot of those metrics are valuable and valid in some sort of context, but the context it has to be is within the organizational context, and as you noted, the objectives and the goals. As Alex Aiken was presenting yesterday, I was just struck by the clarity of objectives that he had up front. I would quibble that some of those were not obviously measurable, but there's some work that could be done there, but the objectives were clear, and that drove everything that they did, and it seemed to pull through on the back end. But I think that is ultimately framing it in the business context. So for most businesses, revenue growth, market share, brand reputation, employee retention, there are some basic building blocks that we have where, okay, well, what are the metrics that are going to be relevant in those? Now, if you can get a little bit more advanced and get to the place that Maureen has, where you can get really customized in terms of what is most meaningful to the business. But I think across all of our clients, we can get to those basic building blocks because the building blocks are known, and the metrics within each of those building blocks, if you consult the right experts, they're there. So let's start with those building blocks, and then we can go to the next level of how do we really tailor and customize and tune it over time to really meet the needs of the business and be in the language of the business, which is where ultimately it should go.
Mark, I assume you have thoughts?
Many. It goes back to this idea that you could begin simply if you simply begin. And it creates an appetite for more resources when, even if you do simple measures and use those as a way to communicate PR's contribution to executives who may not understand public relations, but just get started with it. And even if it's very simple, executives will understand, I think data is the language of business. And if we can communicate in the way that you do, communicate public relations performance aligned with the organization that's specific, it has a time stamp on it, a time frame that's also specific, and that there's buy-in from these executives. It can be done, and that what I just described doesn't have to be complicated or expensive.
I think too, and I don't think anyone on this panel will like this addition, but I think there's an element of it that is, yes, the data, yes, the frameworks, yes, the process, but there's also just the experience of and we focus a lot on trust because of the business we're in, but this experience of, do I trust the data? Does it feel appropriately aggressive and hard, for you? And also, do I trust that the team it has the right capabilities, the right perspective, the right ways of thinking to really advance, the call. And so I do think that there's this experiential and maybe a little bit less tangible aspect of where we all need to go as professionals in being that trust, and everyone says that trusted advisor, but truly being that trusted advisor that is going to use the data in the right way, speak that language of the business, and really be part of shaping that strategy to advance the business.
I think we tend to limit ourselves into communications conversations a lot of times with either executives or clients, as opposed to, well, what happened to the revenue this past quarter? Why did it go up or down? What are the driving factors in that? Like, okay, that's a meaningful conversation that you can have with a sales leader or a marketing leader that can then lead to a variety of PR program recommendations or other things that we can do, but don't have that conversation. Have the focus on what's going on in the business or what's going on in the organization, and then do the hard work behind the scenes to go make something that's meaningful to that.
Okay. The trust question, the trust question is really interesting to me, and instinctively I like the idea of measuring trust. I wonder, do you then have to still answer the question why? Like, do people sort of intuitively go, okay, it's better for us to be trusted, there will be benefits, or do they say, show me the benefits? What does a 1% increase in trust mean for this business in terms of, will it help me get new factories? Well, you're KPMG, so you're not building factories, but new factories built in communities. Will it help me get new business? Will it help me attract employees easier? Will it help me keep employers easier? What's the value of a percentage point in trust in dollar terms? Do you get into that granularity? And can you answer those questions?
Well, for our business, potentially it's a little easier since it is, based on integrity, based on, what we do as we started as audit. But I do think we have to answer those questions. And I think the second piece of that is trustworthiness, and what are the signals, what are the for lack of a better word, and this is actually research from the University of Maryland, but what are those honest signals that you send in sort of establishing that trusted worthiness that makes you most trusted? So what can you control, and then how do people kind of receive you? I think it's really hard, but I do believe it helps navigate the complexities that we all face in the roles that we play, especially with the conversation we just had when it comes to social impact issues, when it comes to when do you speak out, when it comes to how do you advance the business, how do you grow, how do you satisfy kind of the market, shareholders, whoever it is. I do think it gives you the right lens to think about. So, yeah.
Thank you. So with trust resides in the minds of your audiences.
Sure.
It doesn't, you can communicate trust, but if you don't know what trust means to those people, you'll never complete the equation. And if you ask those people what the value of trustworthiness, they'll tell you. Are you more likely to buy a product? Are you more likely to do business with this company? And you'll see that it has value, but it doesn't come through media. It comes through the people you're trying to reach.
Right.
and
It's
they'll
the
tell you.
relationship
Yeah.
that public relations is or should be about. I can't leave time for Q&A, unfortunately, because I have one more question. It's going to take 3 minutes. But what's the impact on all of this on, going back to our first question, on billing, on how public relations agencies charge for their services? I suspect that everybody in this room, like me, believes that public relations agencies are leaving a ton of money on the table because they're shit at measurement. What's the alternative? How do we make more money billing more for value?
Well, I think
And I'll ask you how you can stop them doing that.
well, I think it starts with the investment and the commitment. So, as you said, I think too many firms are not invested, or they have one person who is their, insights person or their analytics person or whatever. No, this needs to be. You do need experts, because not every PR person is going to be an expert in measurement. So you do need experts in this, but you need to make the commitment there. But I think where it really ultimately is going to happen is in the contract process, and I think this is where. Just from our experience, so when I started Big Valley, this wasn't my intent. We kind of fell in, I stopped tracking time because I've been tracking time for 20 plus years, and I'm like, hey, if I can avoid it, I'm going to avoid it. Well, it turns out every client that we talk to, they've got a budget and they've got a set of things that they need to accomplish. So we just framed our scopes of work with them based on their budget and what they needed to accomplish. If we knew that the budget wasn't high enough for that, we ratchet that up. If we go negotiate those pieces of it. We've had 80 clients in 8 plus years. We only have one client that has a billing rate within it, and it's actually a day rate, because that's how we, behind the scenes, we do calculations to be able to know, okay, how much time is this going to take for staff allocation purposes, not for client budgeting purposes. Where we haven't gotten to, which is part of what sparked this session, is it's hard to get to the value and impact piece, because usually at the contract stage, we're working with a client who doesn't have a framework for evaluation. So there's no way to be able to agree upon something until we're working with them for a while and have built up that framework. So I think we want to get to the place where, hey, let's move away from this time billing, because it's just ridiculous, and move to something that is more value building. There's an interim step, which I think is at least results and deliverables focused, but let's go have the conversations to figure out that value alignment.
Okay, Mark, Maureen, if you have anything to add it quickly.
I think there's a danger in this equation, and we haven't talked about it yet.
Oh, good. Open a whole new can of worms. Right.
Just
with
right- that's-
19 seconds to go, please.
Okay, anybody who wants to continue the conversation will be right out there.
Buy his book. I'm sure it's in there.
The danger is that people may value themselves by their billable hourly rate. And we were talking about this earlier, that there's somebody who's got a low hourly billing rate who thinks that that's where that's their status.
Yeah.
They define themselves by their billing rate. And conversely, there's some senior executives who define themselves by their billing rate,
Sure.
and assume a kind of confidence that they may not they might not have earned.
I would just say I think there's a ton. I think we do incredible work, and we don't often get the credit that we deserve for the role we play in really enabling and advancing the business. And so anything we can do to be better at it together, whether agency or in-house, I think is crucially important. So.
Yeah, I think that's the enlightened view, right? Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. We are going to break for coffee. Those of you who have endured through 2.5 days almost, I very much appreciate it, and I would urge you to come back. There are only 2 more sessions, so it won't be for long. We are going to be talking about data and the value of data, and then we're going to be closing out by, we're fortunate to have with us another person from outside of our industry, Dan Glickman, who was the former Agriculture Secretary for the U.S., who's going to be talking broadly about geopolitical risk and, in particular, issues of food security. So I think we have a strong close to the program as well. Thank you very much again for those of you who are still with us, whether in the real world or in the digital realm. And I will see you back here in about 15, 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.